Hi everyone, welcome back to Learn with MedNuggets. So in today's video, I'm going to teach you how to interpret the JVP curve and the ventricular pressure curve. So let's begin. In this diagram, you can see the ventricular pressure curve and the JVP curve. The blue line represents pressure changes in the ventricle, that is the ventricular pressure curve, and the red line represents pressure changes in the jugular vein, which is the JVP curve, right? So in order to understand these two curves properly, we need to go back to the basics and understand the physiology and the anatomy of the heart, right? So let's have a look at the heart. Our heart consists of four chambers: the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle, right? The atria sit at the top of the heart and the ventricles, they sit at the bottom of the heart, as you can see in this diagram, right? So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, they bring deoxygenated blood to the right atrium of the heart, right? So when blood reaches the right atrium of the heart, when it starts to fill up the right atrium of the heart, the pressure inside the right atrium increases, right? When the pressure inside the right atrium increases, it forces open the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve is the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. It's like a door between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So when the pressure inside the right atrium increases, it forces open the tricuspid valve to relieve that pressure, right? Because if there's no door, what will happen is the pressure inside the right atrium will increase, and at a certain point, the right atrium will burst, right? So to prevent that from happening, the right atrium, there's a door between the right atrium and the right ventricle called the tricuspid valve, which opens when the pressure inside the right atrium increases. So when this valve opens, blood travels from the right atrium to the right ventricle. As a result of that, the right atrial pressure will go down. As blood starts to fill up the right ventricle, the right ventricular pressure will go up. The process of blood filling up the right ventricle is called ventricular diastole, right? So when ventricles are relaxing, when ventricles are filling up with blood, the atria are contracting, right? So the same thing that is happening on the right side of the heart is happening on the left side of the heart simultaneously. Okay, even though I'm using the right side of the heart to explain this to you, the same thing is happening on the left side of the heart simultaneously. I'm just trying to go in a systematic way so that it'll help you guys understand this more clearly, right? So once all the blood from the right atrium reaches the right ventricle, right, your tricuspid valve will close. Now you have a right ventricle full of blood, right? Now what happens is your tricuspid valve is closed and you have a right ventricle full of blood, right? So this blood is going to exert pressure against the walls of the right ventricle, right? This blood in the right ventricle is going to exert pressure against the walls of the right ventricle, causing it to contract, right? So when the pressure inside the right ventricle goes up, it forces open the valve of the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary valve, right? Then what happens? Blood flows from the right ventricle into the pulmonary valve where it reaches the lungs, right? There's no direct connection between the right side of your heart and the left side of your heart. The blood from the right side of your heart must go through the lungs in order to reach the left side of your heart. So in the lungs, obviously, your blood gets purified. Deoxygenated blood gets oxygenated, and then your pulmonary vein pumps this oxygenated blood from the lungs to your left atrium. And then it goes to the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta, which pumps blood to the entire body. So that is what happens in a cardiac cycle, right? So now let's move back to the graph. So let's have a look at the blue line over here. So you can see that during ventricular systole, the pressure in the ventricle is very high, right? Obviously, because the ventricles are contracting, right? During atrial systole, the pressure in the ventricles is low because when your atria are contracting, your ventricles are relaxing, right? Your ventricles are getting filled up with blood. At that point, the pressure in the ventricles is low, right? So those are the changes, the pressure changes that are happening in the ventricle. And then now let's have a look at this point in the graph, right? Ventricular diastole, right? So you can see the pressure increasing slightly during ventricular diastole. Now let's have a look at why that's happening, right? So when you take the heart, right? This is the right atrium and this is the right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, right? When the atria are pumping blood into the ventricles, the first 70 milliliters of blood out of 100 milliliters is flowing passively from the atria to the ventricles. These numbers are not accurate. I'm just using random numbers in order to make it easy for you to understand, right? So the first 70 milliliters, the first 70 out of 100 milliliters of blood flow passively from the atrium to the ventricle, right? This is during ventricular diastole, when the ventricles are filling up with blood, when the atrium is pushing blood into the right ventricle, right? As a result of that, and why is it passive? Because of the gravitational pull, right? Because of the gravitational pull, blood flows passively from the atrium to the ventricle, right? After that, it's over here that the atria start to actively contract to push the rest of the blood, the 30% of the blood that's remaining in the atrium to the ventricle, right? So that's why the pressure is increasing over here. Now let's have a look at the JVP curve, right? So before moving on to the JVP curve, it's better if you can understand the anatomy of the jugular vein, right? So what is the jugular venous pressure? Jugular venous pressure is the pressure inside the jugular vein, right? So your jugular vein is a branch of the superior vena cava. Your superior vena cava opens into the right atrium, right? That is what brings blood to your right atrium. So when the superior vena cava brings blood to the right atrium, your right atrium starts to fill up with blood, right? As your right atrium starts to fill up with blood, your right atrial pressure will increase and it will start to contract, right? So when the right atrium is contracting or during right atrial systole, the pressure inside the right atrium is increasing, right? When the pressure inside the right atrium increases, this pressure will back up into the superior vena cava and the jugular vein. As a result of that, when the right atrial pressure increases, your jugular venous pressure will also increase because this pressure backs up from the right atrium into the superior vena cava and from the superior vena cava into the jugular vein. That's how your jugular venous pressure increases, right? So we can conclude the pressure changes of the heart is reflected in the JVP curve, right? So now let's move on to the JVP curve, the red line. So over here, right, you can see this A wave, right? A wave happens during atrial systole. Why is that? Because like I mentioned before, when the atrium contracts, the pressure inside the atrium increases, and this will be translated into the jugular vein, right? This pressure will back up into the superior vena cava and the jugular vein. So when your right atrium is contracting, your jugular venous pressure will increase, right? And then at this point of the graph, right, at the end of atrial systole, your atrioventricular valves will be closed. Both the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves will be closed, right? So at the end of atrial contraction, all the valves in your heart, they are closed, right? Now, at the end of atrial systole, your ventricles will be filled with blood. all the valves are closed now and your ventricles are full of blood. This blood will start to exert pressure against the walls of the ventricle. Right? Did you understand that? So basically, the pressure that is exerted against the walls of the ventricle will cause the ventricles to contract against a closed chamber. I really hope you can understand what I'm saying because this is a very important point, right? So, at the end of atrial contraction, at the end of atrial systole, your ventricles are filled with blood, right? And all the valves are closed. It's a closed chamber. This blood inside the ventricle will start to exert pressure against the walls of the ventricles, and the ventricle will start to contract against a closed chamber, right? This is called isovolumetric contraction. Iso means same, volumetric is volume, same volume, isovolumetric contraction, right? The volume is the same, but the ventricle is contracting. So this line over here, between this line and this line, is isovolumetric contraction, right? And then the ventricles will start to contract, and it will reach a point where it can't handle the pressure anymore. At this point, what will happen is the aortic and the pulmonary valves will open, right, to relieve that pressure. And the blood will flow from the ventricles to the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So what is this C wave over here? This C wave represents isovolumetric contraction, right? So why is the pressure in the jugular vein increasing during isovolumetric contraction? Because during isovolumetric contraction, like I mentioned before, your ventricle is contracting against a closed chamber. And this pressure will back up into the atrium, into the right atrium, which will back up into the superior vena cava and the jugular vein. As a result of that, your jugular venous pressure will increase. If you didn't understand what I said until now, please pause the video and go back and listen to it. Okay? So, during isovolumetric contraction, the pressure of the blood will be backed up into your jugular vein from the right ventricle to the right atrium to the superior vena cava to the jugular vein, and your jugular venous pressure will increase, right? And at this point over here, what's going to happen is your pulmonary valve is going to open. When your pulmonary valve opens, the blood will go from the right ventricle to the pulmonary valve. So at this point, the pressure in the right ventricle will all of a sudden drop. When the pressure in the right ventricle drops, what happens is that whole build-up of pressure to the jugular vein also drops, right? So there will be a descent, which we call the X descent, right? X descent is the time when your ventricles start to contract. So when your ventricles are, another way you can understand this is when your ventricles are contracting, your atria are relaxing, right? When your ventricles are contracting, your atria are relaxing. So at this point, the jugular venous pressure will drop. That's the X descent. The X descent denotes atrial relaxation, right? Then what is this V wave? Now you can see as the ventricles are almost at the end of systole, right? Your atria are at the end of diastole, right? When your ventricles are almost done contracting, your atria have filled up with blood. Your right atrium has filled up with blood, right? So it's full of blood now, about to contract, right? So as it starts to fill up with blood, the pressure in the right atrium will increase, which will be translated into the jugular vein. So over here you can see a small increase in the jugular venous pressure, right? That is this V wave. Then what is this Y descent? Y descent happens during ventricular filling. As the right atrium pushes blood into the right ventricle, the pressure inside the right atrium will go down, and as a result of that, the pressure in the superior vena cava will also go down, and the jugular venous pressure will also go down. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you understood how to interpret the jugular venous pressure curve and the ventricular pressure curve. If you have any questions, please drop it down in the comments section below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.